Stephen Buzenshot from Murren's Trailers in Murray Bridge in South Australia. And probably to Sal, we're interested in low emissions and heavy vehicle, low emissions and zero emission technology on trailers. I know there's been a bit of discussion with OEMs on extra axle masses for the steer and drive. Are you guys coordinating that for any other proposals for the other tri-groups?
We wouldn't coordinate it. We would work collectively with the Commonwealth Department because it would be another ADR issue. I'd like to know more because I'm not aware of what you guys want to do on trailers, so maybe we'll take it offline and get a bit of a briefing. Yep.
Thank you.
Yes, Peter, if you can join us. Yeah. I thought you were going to ask a question, Gavin. Yeah. You approached the microphone that way.
Debbie, I'm going to ask you a question. The focus of this conference is around mass, and we talked about technologies being deployed in the US. We're progressing down a path of in-vehicle mass monitoring here in Australia, which you've heard about. I'm wondering whether you could provide an insight into where the US is at and whether it's going to follow a similar path, or is it already on a path to use embedded technologies in vehicles like Smart OBM here in Australia.
Okay. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. That's a good question, Gavin. And I'm not exactly sure where the US is in having it, in the vehicle right now. But that is something that I can take back and find out and get back with you on that. Okay.
I just realised that I've got the power to look at people and they just get up and ask questions. So this is really powerful. But I should have realised that years ago. Oh, wow.
Hello, thank you for your presentations. That was most interesting. My question is directed towards Deborah. Deborah, my name is Sarah Jones. I'm from Driven. I'm really interested in the American experience of driving data standardisation with your LTPP program. Dr. Allen mentioned efforts within Australia to improve adoption and uptake of a road asset data standard so that we have national consistency in our data measures and hopefully can ultimately leverage from that information to do better network-wide analysis. Could you tell us a little bit about how you were able to get that standardisation in the United States and what the driver was?
Are you Cindy, right? Okay.
Sarah.
Oh, Sarah. I'm sorry, Sarah. So are you talking about the standardization of the distress data, the data collection, or I want to make sure I understand your question.
Yeah, so all of your road data information, all of those separate data measures and codes.
Okay. Okay, well, for the long-term payment performance program is what I mentioned. We do have standard data collection for collecting the payment performance data. The distress data, the smoothness, the structural capacity using the fall and weight deflectometer. And so over time, the long-term payment performance program has been around for a long time, over 30 years. And so when it started back in the early 80s, mid to late 80s, many of those standards were developed then. And as time went on, and as technology improved, the standards were developed and adopted by and used by the LTPP program. So we do have a document, it's called to collect payment performance data, distress data on the pavement. We have a document called the Distress Identification Manual, or the DIM, D-I-M, and you can download that from LTPP InfoPave. So that's an excellent document, and that's what we use to collect the data for the 2,000 plus test sections that we have throughout North America. That standard is used by state highway agencies as well. Not the entire, LTPP is a research program, So many state agencies do not collect data at the research level. So, but they may reference that document for certain, fatigue cracking, spalling, raveling, things like that. So they may reference it to look at our definitions and see how they're measured. But that document is available for anybody to use. We also have standards for collecting profile data to see how smooth the pavement is. And in terms for this conference, and what I think people are really interested here, the LTPP program has developed standards for calibrating the weigh and motion systems. So we have standards when we go out to the WIM sites that we have around North America. We use those standards no matter which state we're in. And so those standards have been used by state agencies as well. It's very expensive to calibrate a WIM system, so not many states are able to afford to do that. But at the national level, and because we have about, right at the time, we have about 15 sites where we have weigh and motions for LTPP that we're monitoring to that degree at the research level, we're able to afford that in the budget. But I hope I'm answering your question. There are standards in place for data collection, for looking at the roadway condition that people can use as a guide. We don't say that you have to do it this way because every state agency does things differently and calls a crack, a longitudinal crack different from another state in the measurement. So we just know what works for our program. And so we do, if you're interested, I would suggest to go to InfoPave, and we can talk later too. But that distress identification manual is available to download, and the weigh and motion calibration procedures that we have is also available as well. And when we're looking at validating the WIM systems, we're not just looking at the components of the sensors in the ground, and we run test trucks over them when we do the testing. But we also do a daily check of the data to make sure the data that's being collected by the WIM system is repeatable, it's falling within our criteria for passing. And if there's something that goes wrong, I mentioned earlier that IRD is our contractor. If something goes wrong with any of the data, doesn't look right, they can always go out to the site and see what's going on before months and months pass and we realized that there was an issue with the system.
Next question. There are two microphones, and you can queue up as well. There's no, you don't have to wait.
I can speak out loud also, but okay, this is better. Hello, my name is Marcelotto. I work at Rijkswaterstaat. It's the National Road Authority in the Netherlands. I have a question to Peter, and it's about the principles or methods that you use to optimize or to make the decision to adapt the infrastructure to heavier and bigger trucks or vice versa. So how do you do that? Because that's a big topic in the Netherlands. And specifically also the difference between bridges and the hard surface, because it seems you focus very much on the bridges, which I understand because it's a very vulnerable piece, a part of the network. But if you look at the total cost, the hard surface is the most expensive one. So what do you do about this?
Thanks very much for that question. And to be honest, it is a real conundrum that we do face in terms of trying to maintain that higher level of productivity and industry's demand to move heavier, using larger and longer vehicles, heavier items of freight across our assets, which are essentially, quite aged.
Sorry, can you speak out louder? I don't hear you.
Sorry, this is on, isn't it? Yep. So it is a real difficulty for us. It is a challenge with industry wanting to move heavier and longer loads across many of our assets, which are quite vulnerable. So it's really about the best we can do at present. Until we get funding to improve the quality of these structures. It's about working in collaboration, in partnership with industry, trying to regulate these movements as best that we can, to make sure that industry is able to keep moving, while maintaining the integrity of the asset that we have at the network. So it probably doesn't really answer your question as much, but it's a serious challenge that we are facing, and we're trying to work across all key stakeholders to manage that as best that we can.
And maybe also on the difference between bridges and hard surface. So it seems the focus is very much on bridges and not on the road surface. Is that true?
Primarily for us, a lot of the focus is on the focus is on both areas, but a significant area of attention at the moment is on our bridge structures, noting in the presentation some of the damage that we're seeing. So they're probably our most vulnerable safety point, I suppose, at the moment. So that's hence why we're having a lot of attention on those primarily at present.
Hi folks, Kim Hassel from Salter, and I'm not going to ask a PBS or a trading question. It's actually one for Peter. Many years ago, this is 2007, I was working on the design of a principal freight network, and problems arose because the chief bridge engineer in the state basically said that these emerging PBS vehicles, our high productivity vehicles, which got approved by ministers in 2006, basically should not go near bridges at more than 5 kilometres per hour. Now this was bit of a shock and such things, and we thought, yeah, lower speeds would actually be good. What was good about your presentation, it raised a couple of questions. One which is, it's probably quite important, and I'm sure it is, was that the stress metric that was put up for, and these were big overloads as opposed to, I suppose, conventional PBS trucks, was at 56k, the stress metric was 215 units, and at 10k was 208, right? Not a huge amount of difference, right? Now, one was 56k, the other one was 10 kilometres per hour, both of which are significantly different to 5 kilometres per hour. But if you had a road and a bridge that basically was, the bridge was in the middle of a 90k or 100k stretch of road, that literally to minimise damage to the bridge, that it's arguable that something like, drop even to 50k would be significant reduction, given the fact that the difference between the 56 and the 10 was very, very different in the stress metric. Now, would you have an opinion on the fact that 5 kilometres per hour for relatively large freight trucks was probably an overreaction, whereas you might consider dropping down from, say, 90 to 60 to 56 to 55 or 50, which is, I'm sure Queensland wouldn't have actually thought to drop that much, but certainly a drop down to that intermediate level of about 56 or something like that would actually be, quite a feasible suggestion.
Great, thank you for the question. So I think it was clear from the data that was presented on that particular structure anyway that there was the difference in the microstrains between that heavy vehicle travelling at 56 kilometres per hour versus the other one at 10. It was quite marginal, I suppose. But what
very marginal.
But what the critical element appears to be from the data that we've certainly shown today was the centre line running to spread that load more equitably across the structure. I think for us that's probably the key priority is to have that as a condition of access to some of these more vulnerable structures, would be to have that centre line running, and of course as a secondary variable then to have it operate at a reduced speed as well, to try and best manage the risk on these bridge movements, I guess. So using that combination would be the best outcome, I guess, in our opinion, but it was clear from the data that's presented the centre line running is critical.
So it is, from a regulatory point of view, feasible to actually, to drop down to something like a 56 or 60 or something like that, as opposed to keeping it at 90 or 100. It would be feasible.
Sorry, can you just state that again?
It would be regulatory feasible to actually have a differential speed limit on across the bridge.
A differential speed limit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, look,
Just for
it's a number of elements. Like this is very early days yet in terms of our journey on this, and we're looking at certainly structurally a number of variables as part of our assessment program. So we've actually got Mandy from our heavy vehicle structures team here.
Hi, I was going to answer your question, Chris. So I'm the project director of the new Class 1 heavy vehicle access regime we're developing in Queensland, which is to solve some of the problems that PK's now shown you. When you actually design a bridge, even to today's bridge standard, you design for a platform to run down the centre of a structure. That's how you actually design a structure. Many years ago, 30 years ago, when our regime was first in, we did have our platforms were required to run down the centre of a structure. Over the years, we've watered that down, and in Queensland, we allow them to run in lane. We will be changing that in the new regime, and they will be going back to centre line. You'll find every other state requires platforms to travel centre down the bridge. So that's why we run the centre line. The speed, when you assess a structure, you assess it at posted speed, or you can reduce your load factors if you assess it at 10 kilometres an hour. So the 10 kilometres an hour is actually limited in the design assessment code, is where the 10k an hour comes from. So for that particular bridge, it's like Peter said, it's a 1968 bridge designed for a 33-tonne truck. When we say 200 microstrain, that's twice as impactful as a higher mass limits road train, so it is a big deal to us. And that bridge is then working very, very hard and is consuming its life. We designed a bridge for 100 years and it's consuming less quicker than what we have designed it for. So getting the vehicles down centre lines is very important, and getting them, if we say they need to be 10, they need to be 10, because that's the difference between a yes and a no answer for access. So that's why we're really keen on monitoring those two things. Thanks.
Thank you,
I'm
Mandy.
available if anyone's got any questions after.
I have to put this down. Sorry, it's... Hi, my name is Alejandra. Everybody knows me as Ali. And I'm the director of an international consulting company that it's Bradley. And working specifically in South America now. And so my question is for Sal, because Australian companies that are multinational and they are overseas, like where I am. And my question would be, we are pushing the chain of responsibility in these places, so that Australian companies have to comply even when they are out of the country. And yes, not many know that they have to as well. So we are trying with local operators for them to understand what the chain of responsibility is. And the website, by the way, you can surf it and it's pretty good. My question is, what would you recommend? What are the do's and don'ts that after years with the chain of responsibility and what you have, where you've been, what would be your recommendations of the do's and don'ts for a manager?
My first do is actually comprehend that what's in the heavy vehicle national law, and the best way to do that is probably come and speak to us. So I have officers that will make it very clear around what the obligations are under primary duties. And we actually do see international, I suppose, consigners as an area that we are focusing on. So if there are Australian companies that are bringing containers into this country, and we've had a recent court case where we were successful in prosecuting the directors of that particular company for not having the appropriate safety management systems in play. So my first do is get your head across the HVNL and the obligations within the law, and the organisation is more than happy to assist in that. So we have resources online, I have resources that are available to come and speak to you, so I really do encourage you to do that. It is an interesting space. So we've now been prosecuting under the primary duties legislation, which came into effect in 2018, really wholeheartedly, probably for the last 2 or 3 years. And there are a number of cases at the moment that we're dealing with, which is really pushing the agenda back up the chain. We don't see a lot of, well, firstly, the driver isn't captured under primary duties, so let's be clear. So the drivers are captured under other regulatory regimes, but the driver at the end of the day is the one who's basically doing a task that an employer or someone has commissioned them to do. So the obligations for us really do sit higher in the chain. What we are seeing across the board is that the level of understanding outside of what I would call mainstream supply chain, so excluding your Coles and Woolies and those sort of supply chain partners, is not as clear or as concise as it should be, and I think more work needs to be done across the board. So to that effect, we've actually established another investigation team within our investigation units which will focus on off-road parties. There's two things we want to do there. We want to understand the behaviour of those off-road parties, so both from an education and improvement perspective, but also starting to hold them to account a little bit more. It is a complex area, right? We won't question that, but the law itself has been pretty clear around what the obligations are under chain of responsibility, and the safety commitment across the chain is critical. So resources are available within the organisation. We have the ability to come out and speak to you guys, or you have the ability to come and speak to us. There's a wealth of information that's currently available. There's a review of the master code that's currently being done. I think the primary duties legislation as they currently stand are still embedding themselves in, which is why we've suggested to the NTC that we don't want to see changes to the primary duties provisions as they currently sit, but it is a complex area.
It is, especially, sorry to, if anyone wants, sorry, just a sec, because you have, here you have local operators that are non-Australians. So you have an Australian company working overseas, having to comply with local operators that don't have to comply. However, we are starting to push it so that they voluntarily comply, and we are seeing that that's happening. So in the come and talk to us, would you push this? Would there be ways of the NVHR sending some resources to, for example, to Argentina or Chile to explain better how to work with the chain of responsibility?
I'm sure I'd have a couple of officers keen to put up their hand, no less. Look, it is a very valid question. I think the obligation ultimately does sit with the Australian presence. And I do comprehend that it might be difficult for you to influence your boards or your decision makers back in Argentina, but I can assure you that a court case might stimulate their interest in making sure that they comply with the law, and I have no issue with doing that. So happy to work with you, happy to maybe put in some provisions as to how we can make your parent company better understand their obligations, but we are putting a lot of effort in holding the supply chain to account, because I want to keep drivers in the industry, and one of the issues we find is if they continue to cop the brunt of the failure that sits up the chain, we won't have drivers. So.
Next question.
Thanks. Steve Shearer from the South Australian Road Transport Association. So I'm not an engineer, I do have a science degree. I am curious about why the rules of physics are different on different sides of state borders. That really intrigues me. But they must be, given the different decisions that we get. My point is this, and I'd be interested in panel members' comments. There's a lot of really good work going on, obviously, from these presentations on monitoring and measuring and managing. That's great. But we're trying to squeeze productivity out of the existing infrastructure, particularly structures, bridges and culverts. One of the things we think is not being thought about enough is facilitating access of the high productivity vehicles with bigger loads on those structures, consuming the life of those structures faster and bringing forward the replacement of key structures. We're not seeing enough of that within government. With all the information that you're gathering, can we not mount a better case with government to better fund earlier replacement of key structures? Because Jeff made the point very clearly, the freight task is growing. That's one law of physics you can't change. Another one is you can't get it all on trains. So we have to make this happen. So how can we utilise all of this good science to help push the argument for bringing forward earlier replacement?
Thanks very much for the question. So look, it's a fair comment to make, and it just comes down to economics and priorities, which I'm sure that you're well aware. We are obviously working on bridge replacement programs. Unfortunately, there's limited funding for these things amongst with all the other competing priorities that government does have. The importance of the freight task is, as we all know, paramount to the national economy. Within TMR, we certainly do have a prioritisation and replacement program. It's just getting dollars allocated towards that.
As Peter indicated, there are issues in relation to economics, and we've seen this week the decision of the Reserve Bank to raise interest rates to reduce demand in the economy, and conversely, a couple of days earlier in the week, the Treasurer spoke about the need to pare back some infrastructure spending because of the demands it's placing. So it is, I think people agree with you on the science and the principle, but as Peter Kolesnik indicated, there are some broader considerations.
Yeah, we focus on cutting 5 to 10 minutes off the motorist journey to work, but we're holding back the economy. It's just nuts.
Any other panels? Okay. Steve.
Yeah, my name is Stephen Jesberger, U.S. Department of Transportation, Federal Highways in Washington, D.C. And I have a question. It's mainly for all 4 panel members, depending on how you want to chime in, and Chris. So if you, as the leader of ISWIM, you may have opinion on this. So a long time ago, the World Bank came up with the International Roughness Index, which transformed the roughness industry and actually standardized things. So across the world, people will be talking the same language with roughness, which was quite handy for those who are in the roughness world. And in the United States, we use 13 vehicle types. I don't know what other countries use for their vehicle types. Some people use vehicle length, some use axle spacing, some use the number of axles down for how to classify vehicles. And what I'm wondering is there some value from what you know as experts from different countries of maybe having a world standard for vehicle class? So when we have our data, we can compare it between different countries. And when somebody does a report and they're talking about certain vehicle types, you can compare between countries. That might have some value. So food for thought, imagining new things. I think that's what somebody said, challenges.
I was, would you like me to go first, panellists? Give you a break here. I'm going to voice an opinion. My view is that everything we've collected, and increasingly when we go to collect any information, we have a purpose in mind. We're collecting some information for an intended purpose. And inadvertently, either the collection or the way we store it or the way we then forget about it, to put it bluntly, informs any future use. Vehicle data I wouldn't classify. I wouldn't bin it, in other words. If we're collecting classification data on a vehicle and its mass, if we know the length, we know the spacings between axles, the mass of the axles, that's how I'd store it. Because I know that by storing it that way, we now have the data analytics and the capability to ask all the questions that even 10 years ago we couldn't ask, so that I can reprocess it into the form I want. We tend to collect information, we then bin it in a way, then we make statements like the ESAs per classification is this. And in front of us, the vehicle classification network system is changing, and yet we're still using ESA values for pavement design, maintenance and so forth. So my view is that storage is cheap, CPU processing is now capable. 40 years ago, in the 80s, when we were doing, when I was with the Australian Road Research Board and we were doing the long-term pavement performance study with the US, the effort was in managing the computer, not doing the data analysis, managing and seeing what we can get out of a PC. Today, we're not in that position. So I would advocate that storing the data the way you collect it opens all the opportunities to do all the analysis that haven't even been thought of yet. but that are important. So that's my personal view as a consultant, but I'll open to everyone else.
Again, in principle, people would not disagree with standardisation. I mean, the greatest improvements in productivity in the world's history was the second industrial revolution, which was standardisation of things like threads and counting of threads on screws and counting of time, etc. So standardisation does lead to improved productivity. But there is a challenge. People have, in nations and jurisdictions and agencies, have deeply rooted practice established in history. That means they don't want to change. And I know in your own country that of the 193 countries affiliated to the UN, something like 180 odd use the metric system, and there are a handful that don't. And as you know, in the US, people cling to these things for not necessarily rational reasons, but in principle, I agree there is a need to standardise.
By the way, the TMG used to be metric, and we went back to English. I couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe it. Yeah. Traffic monitoring guide, for those who don't know. So, anyway, I would be happy to work with people if there's other countries who are interested in doing such a thing. Because I think, I completely agree with you, Chris. We need to store our data in the most detailed data we can so we can have many, many uses for it. But when you do a report and you're coming up with something that you're going to compare, let's do something that the countries can compare with each other. So when we're talking with one another, it kind of is something that would be helpful to one another to what we're doing. So
we could start by calling it a prime mover rather than a tractor.
One last question.
Sorry about this, folks, but I couldn't let this opportunity go past. Initially at this conference, I've only asked technical questions, but this is a not so technical question, and I'll ask Jeff and Sal to comment on this. And as Steve knows, not all that long ago, we had a fatal accident sort of by a particular company in South Australia, and the legal ramifications of that was the magistrate said having a driving licence does not mean you're competent, right? So I thought that would put the cat amongst the pigeons a lot more than it seemingly has, but that's by the by. One of the things is with competency is that even in the Heavy Vehicle Law Review Mark II, competency was phrased at, yes, it belongs with the, didn't say licensing, but with the training and things like that. Now that's true, but the benchmark for that has got to be set somewhere. And I would have thought very, very strongly there needs to be almost a quasi-legal definition of competency that then when you fob it off to the registration and the training authorities, they take up on that. So it's set at a higher level. I'm just interested in your views on that it is actually needs to be a benchmark that is actually almost legally set, as opposed to then fobbing it off to the trainers to actually almost put their own definition on what competency is. Any queries?
You go first and I'll add some comments.
Thanks, Kim. And as Tony Jones used to say on Q&A, I'll take that as a comment rather than a question. I appreciate, so one of the good things about working for Austroads as opposed to my previous incarnation at the NTC is we don't get to comment on policy, which is a good thing. So I'll hand to my colleague Sal to answer.
So I will comment. I fundamentally believe that the role of issuing the licence is a state-based function. But I think the categorisation of the competencies required to operate a heavy vehicle in this country do vary based on the task and type of vehicle that is driven. And I think there needs to be a regime that actually starts to quantify what those capabilities and competencies are. And I'm of the view that I think that the regulator has a role in that. To date, the regulator hasn't been invited to have a role in that, and I think we should. Because we're the ones that see it, we're the ones that assess it, we're the ones that are dealing with it on a day-to-day basis. I'm really looking forward to the work that comes out of Austroads. But what's quite clear is that the current regime is not working. It's actually failing us. It's actually producing drivers that are a risk not only to themselves but to the broader economy and to the broader community that drives on the road network. Yes, there's an issue of driver shortages, but if we can continue to kill them or kill others, we're not going to have them anyway. So I think a regime that actually quantifies the task, the type of vehicle that you drive, and you continue to build your capabilities, I think should definitely be in place. Whether that's legislated, Kim, or not, that's ultimately a decision for the NTC and ministers. But what is quite evident, and you've seen it through the work you're doing, the system that currently we have does not work. And if we continue that system, we'll continue to just go down to the lowest common denominator and probably end up killing more people than we need. So who plays a role in it? Very clear, don't want to issue the plastic, don't want to issue the digital app. But in terms of the competencies that are required to operate a heavy vehicle in this country, I think the regulator should be playing a role.
Thank you. That brings us to the close of this.
Can I just make a statement, please? Sorry.
Please do, yes.
I'm watching and listening with interest where the road agencies are going with oversize over mass, and I comprehend the issue. But I do implore all of you to consider the speed differentials and the impact it has on other road users and its impact on how that is managed. And I comprehend infrastructure, but a loss of life due to a decision that's made to create a speed differential in an environment where we can't have enough escorts or pilots or comprehension is a far greater outcome as well. So I just ask the road managers to give consideration when you do this, because the need to then have centre line running, we don't have enough escorts in this country, we don't have enough drivers. How you manage that needs to be carefully considered, because ultimately there's a regulatory activity that we will need to do. I comprehend the engineering issue, but we need to balance the outcome and the way you reach a solution, because the ramifications could be far greater to the economy and to the lives of Australians. So just a comment.
All right. Can I have you show your gratitude to our panel and our speakers?